needs. This has been very much the issue for this afternoon. Is there room for man under the sovereignty of God? Professor.
Idol worshippers. Verse 64 of chapter 3 invites the followers of these revealed religions to come together with Muslims on the basis of what they have in common, i.e. that they shall worship none but God, and that they shall ascribe no partner unto him, and that none of them shall take others for lords other than God. The Quran regards peaceful cohabitation as the rule, and thus addresses Muslims by saying, God forbids you not with regard to those who fight you not for your faith, not drive you out of your homes from dealing kindly and justly with them, for God loves those who are just. Contents of these verses have been reflected in Article 14 of the 1979 Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which, after referring to this verse, requires the government of Iran and all Muslims to treat non-Muslims justly and in good manner, and to observe their human rights. It is with the same view that Ali ibn Abi Talib, the fifth Shiite Imam and the fourth Caliph of Islam, in what may be described as the manifesto of his government, and in fact this fact was mentioned by Ayatollah Araqi briefly this morning as well, in 1400 years ago, orders Malik Ashtar, one of the companions whom he was to appoint as the governor to Egypt, to treat all people irrespective of their religion in a just and fair manner, because, as he puts it, they are either your brothers in religion or your fellow human beings. The very use of the word Allah from the Greek hotheus in the Islamic ideology for describing the one transcendent creator who creates and owns everyone and everything, and to whom we shall all return, was an attempt to rely on similarities. This word was well known and used by Arabs, whether Christian, Jewish, or otherwise, before Islam, and the Quran retained it in an attempt to use even this similarity in terminology as a source of unity rather than divergency, in a world which in the eyes of Islam is God-oriented. From this, let me now turn to the main subject of my paper, which, bearing in mind the fact that I am a lawyer and not a philosopher, nor an expert in political sciences, has been written from a legal perspective. Of course, one should not overlook the interrelation between the Islamic political thought and the Islamic jurisprudence. And forgive me if I read this from my paper. It is to save some time. Because of shortage of time, I prefer to read this from my paper so that I can give you a brief account of a very lengthy paper which I have written, and I understand it has been published by the Catholic University. This paper relates to the question which is the main theme of this session, i.e., is there room for man in Islamic law, which, as I said earlier, is not separable from Islamic political order and lies at the heart of Islam itself. Here I have tried to show how Islamic law is both God-given and man-made. In other words, the role of human beings in the development of Islamic law and Islamic political thought has not been undermined by the fact that these are God-given. We know, of course, that it is one of the aims of every system of law to regulate human relations in a given society. By the lapse of time, however, human societies change, and such relations are thus complicated. People's needs also change constantly. It is therefore essential for every legal system to contain a degree of flexibility in order to meet this changing aspect of human society. It is the aim of this paper to discuss whether and to what extent this flexibility exists in Islamic law as a religious system, enabling it to create a balance between the will of God and the need of man. To start with, it can be said that the degree of flexibility contained in a legal system depends very much upon the nature of the lawmaker in that system. In a dictatorship, a parliamentary system, or a common law system, for example, where the major source of the law is respectively the wishes and orders of the man or party in power, the ideas of members of parliament, or the opinions of the judiciary, the views of the lawmaker are subject to change. The law derived from these sources, therefore, is also capable of easy changes. In a religious system like Islam, on the other hand, as the character of the lawmaker is unchangeable, neither is the law derived from him subject to constant changes. In Islam, the opinion of one person or a group of people cannot change the law of God. It is only God who is fully aware of the necessities of human society, whereas human beings, as the Quran puts it, have not been given but a little of knowledge. The Quran in another verse addresses people by saying, "You may dislike a thing while it is good for you, and you may like a thing while it is bad for you. God knows and you know not." Such a creature is thus expected to submit and surrender totally to the Almighty. This is in fact what the word Islam literally means, i.e., complete surrender to God. Needless to say, the situation will not change if the opinion which contradicts the laws of God belongs not to one person or a group of people, but to the majority or even all people. The plurality of wrongs will still be wrong. In fact, according to the Quran, throughout history, every new phenomenon, including every new idea at its inception, has been rejected by the majority of people, although it might have been correct. The Quran tells us, for example, that every prophet embarking on his mission was initially rejected by the majority and believed in only by few. Phrases like "few of my bondmen are thankful" or "most of mankind do not believe" are frequently found in the Quran. It is interesting to observe that even the legal effect of ijma' or consensus of opinion among Muslim jurists, which is one of the four sources of discovering Sharia law, is not based upon the majority principle. Its legal effect is instead based upon certain statements of the Prophet, such as his statement, "My community will never agree in error," and verses like verse 115 of chapter 4, which reads as follows: "As for him who follows a path other than that of the believers, we shall leave him unto that himself has chosen, and shall cause him to endure hell, and how evil a journey's end." But to return to the concept of flexibility of the law, one can summarize what was said above by stating that in religious systems like Islam, the faculty of determining different values and criteria, including enacting different laws, belongs to God. People in these systems do not create, let alone change, the law of God. Their responsibility is limited to discovering what the law of God is. This is what is meant by divinity of law in such systems. And this is why it is offensive to a Muslim to use words such as Mohammedan law, which is sometimes used, and in fact in the University of London until a few years ago, the subject offered as Islamic law was called Mohammedan law. It is offensive to a Muslim to use words such as Mohammedan law, however negligently they may be used, as using this terminology is taken to reflect an attempt to deny the divine origin of Islam and Islamic law and imply that Sharia originated from Muhammad and not from the Almighty. It appears from what was said above that the divine nature of Islamic law makes it more resistant to social changes and less prepared to take into account the human will. This, however, must not be taken as meaning that social changes may not have any effect on this law because, and I quote, "No Muslim, however orthodox he may be, believes for a moment that Islamic law dropped down complete from heaven in any way analogous to that in which the goddess Aten is depicted in Greek mythology as having sprung fully armed from the mind of Zeus. Instead, the Sharia would be described by Muslims as both a divine law and also a lawyer's law, since it is regarded as firmly based on divine revelation on the one hand, as having been worked out by a series of great jurisconsults on the other. So in other words, although it is God who proposes the law, it is the duty of man to dispose it. The role of ijtihad appears here, to create a fusion between the will of God and the necessities of man. This is made possible by the fact that the two main sources of Islamic law, the Quran and the Sunnah, or precedent of the Prophet, are not, unlike what they appear at first sight, so rigid. As far as the Quran is concerned, some of its verses are allegorical, mutashabihat, as opposed to ummahat, or fundamentals. In other words, they are open to various interpretations according to different criteria. This is meant to guarantee the Quran's ability to be utilized at all times for all people. The Prophet refers to this aspect of the Quran when he says, "The appearance of this book is beautiful and its interior deep and profound, so much so that its full understanding is out of the reach of even the most intellectual minds. It has many stars, each one of them has in turn many stars. The miracles of this book are countless, and its novelty never stales." As a result of this characteristic of Quranic verses, some general rules have been derived from them to offer solutions to the changing problems of human society. The negation of hardship rule, nafy usr haraj, for example, which can inter alia accommodate the contents of the theory of changed circumstances in Islamic contract law, is based upon various Quranic verses. For example, verse 6 of chapter 5 declares God would not place a burden on you. And verse 78 of chapter 22 provides, He has chosen you and has not laid upon any hardship in religion. This rule has been reflected in the laws of Iran to allow a wife to apply to the court for divorce if continuation of conjugal life causes hardship beyond forbearance to her, and to allow a tenant to ask for a respite if immediate evacuation of the leasehold property causes hardship to him or her. As far as the tradition of Prophet as the second source of Islamic law is concerned, many of his statements are in the form of general rules which may be applied to various situations. The principle of no unfair loss, which is correlated to the negation of hardship rule, is based upon the Prophet's statement, "No one should cause or suffer an unjustifiable loss in Islam, la dharara wa la dhirara fil Islam," and can be used to justify legislations requiring payment of compensation for any unjustifiable loss caused to people, even though the act or omission causing the loss may not have been directly dealt with by Sharia. A clear example of this is losses caused by traffic offenses. Similarly, by applying this principle, a contract may be avoided if its performance becomes extremely burdensome for the promiser. According to a famous Muslim jurist, a contract whose performance becomes so burdensome as to involve great loss may be terminated. The principle of no unfair loss is derived from a decision of Prophet in a famous case. related from him in both Sunni and Shia law texts with minor differences. The facts of the case, which happened in Medina, where the Prophet had established an Islamic government in the years AD 622 to 632, are as follows. A man called Samurat ibn Jundab had a tree in a garden, the only entrance to which was through another's house. He frequently entered into the house during day or night without asking for permission, with the alleged purpose of irrigating his tree, ignoring the objections of the owner. The man complained to Prophet Muhammad. The Prophet summoned Samura and recommended to him that he should ask for permission before entering into the house. Samura said objectionably, "How should I ask for permission when I want to go to my own tree?" The Prophet even suggested that he may sell the tree at a higher price or exchange it for one or more trees somewhere else. The Prophet went as far as saying that if Samura was prepared to abandon the tree, he would instead guarantee him a tree in paradise as a reward for his goodwill. When all these suggestions were rejected by the owner of the tree, the Prophet addressed him and said, "You are a man who wants to cause loss, whereas there shall be no unfair loss in Islam." He then ordered for the tree to be taken out and given to Samura so that he might put it wherever he wanted. The principle contained in this case is a cornerstone of Islamic law. It has frequently been invoked by traditional Muslim jurists to justify their views on unacceptability of causing undue losses or of abusing a right. And these are some of the examples mentioned by Muslim jurists. Prohibition of hoarding, prohibition of causing a loss to another in order to avoid a loss to oneself, prohibition of building a house with a bathroom which causes such a great and unreasonable amount of smoke as to annoy the neighbors, prohibition of staying in public places such as mosques or markets for so long as to make it difficult for other potential users to enter, prohibition of taking ownership of pastures located around villages and used by the villagers to feed their animals, prohibition of someone with a contagious disease living among the healthy, prohibition of extravagant use of the water supply in a way that the right of other users is adversely affected, and prohibition of annoying the neighbors by placing odorous rubbish in one's property, which is in fact the exact wording of one of the articles of Majalla, the Ottoman Empire Civil Code, are only a few examples reflecting the effect of the principle of no unfair loss. The principle has also been reflected in the laws of Iran. According to Article 40 of the 1979 Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran, no one is entitled to exercise his rights in a way injurious to others or detrimental to public interests. Similarly, Article 132 of the Civil Code provides a person cannot make use of his property in such a way as would necessarily involve a loss to the neighbor, except such use as is reasonable and is required to satisfy his needs or to prevent his loss. This article limits the operation of another principle, which is called the principle of taslit, i.e. absolute legal authority of an owner to deal with his or her property as he or she wishes, as contained in Article 30 of the Civil Code. In one case, the Higher Civil Court of Tehran affirmed a judgment by the county court and held that the appellant was required to cover his small garden, since irrigation of the garden caused damage to the adjacent wall belonging to the neighbor, and since this was not counterbalanced by a greater interest, namely satisfaction of the appellant's needs or the prevention of his loss as required by the latter part of Article 132. Due to shortage of time, I cannot discuss in detail the meaning and scope of the doctrine of ijtihad, through which Islamic law can go hand in hand with human need and social changes. And for that, I refer you to the full text of the published article. I should only say that ijtihad can best be defined as the power which enables a jurist to apply fundamental, unchangeable principles of Sharia to new situations in order to solve new problems of the human society. This definition contains the two essential factors for any culture's ability to continue to exist. On the one hand, it indicates that there must exist fundamental, unchangeable principles in any culture claiming permanence. Otherwise, it may be abandoned altogether. On the other hand, if these fundamental principles do not have the capacity to meet changing contemporary needs, the culture will cease to exist as a living force. It may be said that the existence of unchangeable principles in Islam is due to its divine origin. These principles are not subject to change because in Islamic view they are based upon human nature or fitrah, which is not subject to change. On the other hand, the generality of these principles, and in other words, their capacity to be applied to changing circumstances, is due to Islam's supposed permanence, which requires it to be able to solve the problems of every age. Therefore, a good mujtahid or person who exercises ijtihad is one who strikes a balance between flexibility and inflexibilities of Islamic law in a way that neither of these two aspects of the law, i.e. divinity and permanence, is impaired. At the end of this part, I must also make a brief reference to the useful principle of tolerance or ibaheh in Islamic jurisprudence. This principle can be used to justify legislations in respect of any need of human society, provided such legislations do not contravene the terms of Sharia. And at the end, let me conclude what I said by reading to the following paragraphs of my paper. A religious system of law like Islam, which claims to have been originated from God and also claims perpetual validity for its application, needs to provide a certain degree of flexibility in applying the cardinal rules to actual cases in different ages. This is so because with the passing of time, the society faces new problems which could not even be contemplated by the people living in the past, without a provision being made to permit mankind to enact proper laws or to interpret existing laws within the general framework of Sharia to deal with these new problems and to find solutions to them. Islamic law would certainly have been inadequate after the first Islamic era. That here we have to make a comparison between Sunni and Shi'i laws. Apparently, approximately from the 6th, 7th centuries AD, the so-called gate of ijtihad was closed in Sunni law, and therefore a belief grew among the people that no one else, apart from the founders of the 4 Sunni schools, was as competent as they were to exercise ijtihad. And therefore, this is referred to in the history of Islamic law as the closure of the gate of ijtihad, and therefore we were limited to the 4 fundamental schools of jurisprudence of Hanafi, Hanbali, Shafi'i, and Maliki schools. But as far as the Shi'i law is concerned, of course, the gate of ijtihad was never closed, and therefore all living jurists could exercise ijtihad at all times, bearing in mind the fundamental principle, unchangeable principles of Sharia, and the human need, which of course changed constantly by the passing of time. Therefore, I think the short answer to your question would be that any competent jurist who has the ability of inferring Islamic law from its main sources, and at the same time is aware of the new conditions in which the Muslim society lives now, of course, has the ability to exercise ijtihad for solving those problems. But as far as Iran, for example, is concerned, in which a government has been created, has been established, and that government needs to answer these new problems that society faces, of course, there is a special way of parliament, and it is the parliament who will recognize those needs by enacting laws which should not be in contradiction with Islamic law. So in that process, I think ijtihad has to be applied, that when Parliament wants to make new laws, it has to make sure that these two aspects of Islamic law are observed. Process is the same, whether it is one mujtahid who wants to discover and interpret the laws of God in a way for it to be able to solve the new problems, or whether we are having a government which wants to do the same thing. I think the government also should have the same process. If, when we are talking about a society in which an Islamic government is not established, then it is up to a mujtahid to do that. Then in a society we may have the parliament. What is the duty of the parliament? Is to enact laws which have two features. On the one hand, they do not contradict the laws of God. And on the other hand, they are capable of meeting the problems and the needs of the human society for which that parliament or that government has been established. So I think in that process, which is what exists in Iran, in that process, when they want to enact laws, they have to look at the sources of Islamic law with having this in mind, that those must be able to solve the problems that this society faces. Of course, there are many mujtahids who may have different views, but when we have a government, we of course do not care what those mujtahids have to say, because this is true of any other system as well. There are many lawyers in a secular system who may have different views. And of course, we don't care what their views may be or how they reach at those views. What we are concerned with is that the institution which has been vested with the power and duty of enacting laws should bear these two things in mind, that in order to enact proper laws, it has to adhere to the unchangeable principles of Sharia law, but to interpret them in a way that the laws which are derived from those sources are such that they can answer and meet the problems that society faces.